Alright, we're going to talk today about Princess Diana of Wales, her life and mental health. Part 1 will be about her life, a brief biography, and Part 2 will focus more on her mental health. So let's go. First of all, her family. Where did she come from? Oops. She came from the Spencer family, which were aristocratic. Her parents were John Spencer and Frances Shand Kidd. She had two older sisters, the eldest Jane and the second Sarah. Later, Diana would go on to have a sibling rivalry with Sarah, as Sarah dated Prince Charles before Diana married him, and Diana would for a time overreact to Sarah's inquiries about her relationship with the prince. Diana was the third child. Diana's parents wanted an aristocratic male heir. Diana was not male, so she felt a sense of being a disappointment to her parents. Diana's younger brother was Charles, and because they were a bit younger, they were generally closer to each other than to the older sisters. Childhood. Diana's parents divorced when she was 7. She rarely saw her mother after that point, so she developed some symptoms of separation anxiety, trying to take care of her father, as if trying to be the mother figure she generally lacked. So after Diana's mother became mostly absent, the Spencer children began treating their nannies poorly. Sometimes those nannies would in turn become abusive. So even in childhood, Diana displayed characteristics which would define her personality and mental health throughout her life: depression, obsessive behavior, unpredictable moods, and even occasional food binging. She was also an observant girl with a playful, energetic nature. But Diana, even in youth, was hard to pin down. Her essential character, she had a tendency to lie, and her fluctuating moods contributed to this perception. So she went to Silfield Day School, ages 6 to 9. She felt horribly different as the only child with divorced parents. Then she went to Riddlesworth boarding school from ages 9 to 12. She was helpful and made friends, but she was inattentive. And then she attended West Heath boarding school, ages 12 to 16. And here, despite her seemingly average academic intelligence, she failed all of her O-level exams twice, which used to be taken in the UK at about age 16. Aside from her academic performance, West Heath was mostly a good place for Diana's mental health, as she made friends and was in a well-structured, supportive environment. And when Diana was a teenager, her older sister Sarah, who she idolized to some degree, developed anorexia nervosa and was actually hospitalized because it was so severe. Seeing this caused Diana's bulimia to emerge as well, although her condition was not yet as severe as her sister's. First jobs. Diana briefly attended a finishing school called the Institut Alpin Vidamenet, during which she was homesick, so she left that pretty soon. She began a job teaching ballet to young children and quit after 3 months without explanation or communicating with her boss. And after this, she landed jobs she enjoyed more as a babysitter and assistant kindergarten teacher. Then she met the man she would later marry, Prince Charles. Diana had read many of her step-grandmother's romance novels, which influenced her conception of potentially marrying Prince Charles. Charles felt a strong, dutiful obligation to find a wife and get married. He was in the royal family, and his family and the press, seeing that he was getting older, were insistent that he marry soon. But Diana was only 19 when she began dating Charles. She was inexperienced and untrained for royal life. Charles, on the other hand, was 31, had graduated from college, served in the military, was trained in royal etiquette, and had engaged in physically rigorous sports and activities. So, tabloids and the press effect. Even as early as when Diana started dating Charles, the tabloid reporters were all over it. So this, when Diana was 18 or so, already contributed negatively to her mental health. That little video there is just a clip of Diana much later in her life telling the paparazzi to get lost. But throughout her life, starting with when she dated Charles, the press, the tabloids had a negative effect on her mental health. The wedding. So, after Diana's wedding, for a good amount of time, she was seen as this perfect fairy tale princess. Popularly, she became a superstar in fashion and as this image of kind of returning to a kind of Victorian beauty. So she became idolized by people and girls around the world. You can see that clip there as well, demonstrating why that might be the case. She was beautiful, this perfect dress, and yeah. Early married life. So after her first child was born, Prince William, Diana had, at the time, it was called postpartum depression, which we'll get into more a little bit later. But early in the marriage, already Diana's mood was still fluctuating a bit, and it was very difficult for Charles to understand her, what she was going through, and he didn't really know how to help her either. And again, she was not trained exceptionally well for her royal duties, although she was trained, but she was suddenly in the attention spotlight from the press, and she wasn't very well trained to do her royal duties, and she had some mental health issues that persisted throughout her life and became quite severe even early in the marriage. So, alternative therapists. Diana, unfortunately, and medication, she instead preferred New Age treatments, astrologists, psychics, tarot readers, hypnotherapy, etc. And these did not help her as much as if she had gone the tried and true route. The royal attitude at the time was stiffen your upper lip and deal with it regarding mental illness. So both the royal family and the press would have looked very negatively on Diana if she had gone the more tried and true psychiatrist, psychologist route of treatment. So that definitely influenced her behavior as well. So affairs, I don't have a ton here about their affairs, but the first one for each of them was in 1986. So this is 5 years after the marriage, and Prince Charles was by this point rather done with dealing with Diana's moods and her impulsivity and her distress, and so he returned to someone he had gone out with before marrying Diana, Camilla Parker Bowles, and they had an affair. So partly in response to this, Diana had an affair of her own in November of 1986. So even years later, in 1991, Diana sought out the tabloid reporter Andrew Morton, who she cooperated with to create a tell-all account of her life and struggles, which ended up painting Prince Charles and much of the royal family in a bad light and somewhat unfairly. This was published in June 1992. So although Charles... Alright, Diana and Charles' affairs. So I'm not going to talk very much about this, I'm just going to introduce it. So 1986 was a pivotal year in this area, in that by this point it had been about 5 years since the marriage, and Charles did not know how to deal with Diana's undiagnosed borderline personality disorder and the associated mood swings, impulsivity, etc. And so he kind of gave up early in 1986 on the marriage, and so he initiated an affair with his previous flame, Camilla Parker Bowles, and then later in the same year, in November, Diana began a 5-year affair with cavalry officer James Hewitt. That's all I'm going to say about that. And then, 1991, this is another 5 years later, again, the marriage was still being kept up with a facade as if it was going well, but by this point, it was just that. It wasn't intimate anymore. And so, in 1991, Diana sought out tabloid reporter Andrew Morton and cooperated with him to create a tell-all account of her life and struggles, which ended up painting Prince Charles and much of the royal family in a bad light and somewhat unfairly. This was published in June 1992, and it hastened their divorce, even though that wasn't finalized until 96. Charitable and humanitarian work. The biggest thing here was Diana was a patron of the National AIDS Trust, and there was a big press event where she shook hands with an AIDS patient without wearing a glove, so this really worked to lessen the stigma around the disease. Death. So she died, unfortunately, at age 36 in 1997 as a passenger in a car accident. The inquest into the cause of her death was not held until 10 years later, and so there are conspiracy theories about what actually happened in the meantime, but as the result of the inquest, she was unlawfully killed by the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the pursuit of the paparazzi. In the funeral, 1997, an estimated 2 billion people watched the event, and so that just attests to her superstar popularity. And Elton John sang Candle in the Wind during the service. And again, this reflects a one-sided view of her, which the press often reinforced. Many idolized her despite her troubled life. A bigger picture. So she struggled with mental health for most of her life. As a child, the divorce of her parents and separation from her mother was dramatic, and for most of her life, she displayed volatile, shifting moods and overall personality. She was sometimes deceitful and was difficult to fully know or pin down. I've got a mental health timeline. We'll go through this kind of quick. We've already seen most of these. When she was born in 1961, she was supposed to be a boy. That idea. Again, the divorce, separation issues, and anxious attachment. Got her 3 schools here. Then her older sister, Sarah, was hospitalized in May 1975 for severe anorexia symptoms, and that seems to have influenced Diana's own bulimia nervosa emerging. And I'll skip some of these things until in 1981, the year of her marriage, she was persuaded to seek psychiatric help for the first time. Then a year later, with the birth of the first child, she had perinatal depression and self-injury. She sought help again. And then after the birth of their second child in 1984, the marriage went downhill, and then in 1986 we see the first affairs. I'm going to kind of skip much of the later parts of her life here. So the first DSM diagnosis we have is borderline personality disorder, and there are 9 things you can look at for diagnosis, and it was striking to see that Diana met criteria for all of them. So I won't read them all, but first is frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Yes, she was very clingy and feared rejection or abandonment. A pattern of stable, unstable, and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. Yes, she idealized Charles, her prince, and devalued herself. Identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. Yes, she had an unstable identity and poor self-image. And then I'll skip to number 5, and then we'll go on. She had recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, or threats, and definitely self-mutilating behavior, usually cutting. The next DSM diagnosis is bulimia. At 5'10", her weight sometimes dropped as low as 110 pounds. So we had recurrent binge eating within a 2-hour period, an amount of food definitively larger than what most individuals would eat in a similar period, a feeling that one cannot stop eating or control how much one is eating. And there's the purging behavior, vomiting in her case. And it does not occur exclusively during episodes of anorexia nervosa. And the third DSM diagnosis is perinatal depression, which used to be called postpartum depression, and she would have met criteria for that in 1982. A common scale used to measure this is the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, and if she had taken that questionnaire in 1982, she certainly would have met criteria. Again, the reason it was changed from postpartum depression to perinatal depression is because about 50% of postpartum major depressive episodes start before delivery. And a non-DSM diagnosis is anxious attachment. This is very relevant for Diana's separation anxiety issues early in life, and we'll just read some of these WebMD listed items here. So in a relationship, anxious attachment can look like neediness or clinginess, lack of boundaries, jealousy, trouble showing vulnerability, feeling anxious when you're away from your partner, wanting to pull away when someone needs you, becoming obsessed with or fixated on someone, constantly seeking assurance of your partner's feelings for you, sabotaging the relationships by starting fights or cheating, and trouble getting over a breakup. So for most of those items listed there, Diana met the criteria, you could say. And I'm going to skip this here. We'll talk about the 4 Ds in psychology. The first is deviance. The meaning of deviance is any behavior that differs significantly from what is considered appropriate or typical for a social group. So examples of her deviant behavior: failing her O-level exams twice, her pattern of quitting early in a process, whether it was ballet teaching, therapy, or in some cases, her charitable causes, her pattern of lying, telling altered stories when recalling her past, and of course her bulimia, mood swings, and she flouted royal norms for better or worse, whether it was arriving late to functions or wearing provocative or unusual clothing. And the second D is dysfunction. In psychology, dysfunction refers to a significant impairment or disturbance in an individual's thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. Some of her dysfunctional thoughts, feelings, and behaviors included her bulimia, self-injury, depression, impulsivity, low self-worth, and perfectionism. And then distress, the next D, broadly defined as a state of emotional suffering characterized by symptoms of depression and anxiety. It is also characterized by other somatic symptoms like insomnia, headaches, and lack of energy. And so there are several occasions in her life, especially when stress was high, where she would have acute distress, whether it was paranoia, depression, feelings of abandonment, emptiness, needing to seek psychiatric help, or chronic insecurity. And the last one, danger. This is pretty self-explanatory: when individuals become likely to do harm either to themselves or to others. So her self-harm, cutting again here, and the anorexic starvation component of her bulimia definitely qualify for danger there. And then the better treatment she received, she did see a psychiatrist in 1981 when she first went. She was prescribed the tranquilizer Valium, which she rejected, and she did not really improve as a result of that 1981 treatment. Then late 82 to 1983, she sought help again. She went to see a Jungian specialist who focused on dream analysis, but she ended treatment after several months, saying she no longer needed it, which is not true. And then again in 1988, several years later, she saw Dr. Maurice Lipsedge, a psychiatrist who frequently dealt with eating disorders, but again she gave up early on the therapy in a matter of months, and her symptoms persisted afterwards. Again, I'm just going to read some of this quote here. Diana's approach suggested a classic adult response to childhood neglect, as described by psychologist Hugh Missildine, author of Your Inner Child of the Past. The behavior pattern, according to Missildine, includes moving from one person to another, hoping that someone will supply whatever is missing, and feeling restless and anxious due to an inability to find emotional satisfaction. Anyone who offers admiration and respect has appeal. Because the need for affection is so great, the ability to discriminate is severely impaired. As Diana zigzagged through the world of alternative treatments, there is scant evidence that any of them actually eased her problems, with the possible exception of acupuncture, which research studies have shown to alleviate mild to moderate depression. So a better treatment plan. Dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, is the gold standard treatment for borderline personality disorder. It involves mindfulness, emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, and distress tolerance. For bulimia, training by a dietitian can help. enhanced cognitive behavioral therapy, and sometimes an antidepressant like fluoxetine. For perinatal depression, there is a medication called brexanolone, specifically to treat severe perinatal depression, and therapy can also help. So Diana would have benefited most from a long-term psychotherapist with a qualified professional who is aware of all of her conditions and who is able to give her discretion from the press and the royal family.